Hi, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Why is New Jersey Cutting Down Its Best Defense Against Climate Change? Forestry versus Ecological Restoration. My name is Emile DeVito. I'm Manager of Science and Stewardship at the New Jersey Conservation Foundation, so I'm pinch hitting for Elliot. And in the background is Dylan Medici, Manager of Outreach and Education for the New Jersey Highlands Coalition. He'll be managing all the technical stuff, making sure we have the slideshow working properly and putting questions together from the attendees. So you're all in for an incredible treat tonight. Leslie Sauer, who probably knows more about New Jersey's forests than just about anybody. She has been working on forest issues and ecological restoration of forest landscapes for many decades. She is the owner of Brook Hollow Farm along the Wickecheokee Creek in Hunterdon County. She's the founder of Andrew Pogon Associates, an ecological restoration firm that has been restoring natural areas all over the country, in fact, even in other parts of the world. And she has developed all sorts of innovative techniques for doing ecological restoration work. She's worked in degraded environments, developed environments, natural environments, especially familiar with the problems posed by deer and invasive species. She's got a long list of accomplishments, developing watershed management projects such as the flood protection plan for the Passaic River, the Rockaway River watershed, working for the National Park, the New York City Park Service in Central Park and Prospect Park, and also on national parks throughout the country. Leslie wrote The Once and Future Forest, which is a spectacular book which will never go out of date. It's a guide to forest restoration strategies. Leslie once mapped virtually the entire pine barrens in terms of vegetation types and habitats in her student days. And she has been all over the state, the country, the world, learning and understanding how forests function from an ecological perspective. The New Jersey Highlands Coalition has set up and is producing this webinar. The Highlands Coalition is a nonprofit organization based out of Boonton, New Jersey. Their mission is to protect, enhance, and promote the vital water and other natural and cultural resources of the New Jersey Highlands, 860,000 acre swath of northern New Jersey mountains. And despite comprising only 17% of the land in New Jersey, they provide over 70% of New Jersey residents with clean, affordable drinking water. So the Highlands are a very important part of New Jersey. And in addition to the Highlands, of course, in New Jersey, we have the Pine Barrens, which were protected, sort of protected very well about 43 years ago in the late 70s and early 80s with the Pinelands Protection Act. And Leslie's work in the Pine Barrens was a run-up to some of that legislation that protected the Pine Barrens. That was a long-winded introduction, but finally, at last, you get to hear Leslie Sauer talk about ecological restoration of our forests. Take it away, Leslie.
Basically, I'm just really grateful to be here and to have this opportunity. I want to thank Emile for the introduction. I want to thank the Highlands Coalition for this opportunity because I just think it's an absolutely crucial point in time for New Jersey's forests. I will be talking to you as a practitioner. My focus has been for 50 years how to restore forests. And I would like to bring my perspective on what kind of management we need in public forests, which I believe is ecological restoration. And I want to focus in particular on issues related to climate, because I think this is the most serious threat facing our forests altogether. At the same time, the forest is, in fact, one of our best tools for dealing with the conditions that we have created with excess use of fossil fuels. We have to do more than meet the goals that we are not meeting right now, either at the state level, the federal level, or the global level. And we actually have to start taking carbon out of the air. There are only a very few things that do that. And we're talking basically about trees. Sequestration by and vegetation, including swamps and things like that. But it includes removing carbon from the atmosphere using photosynthesis, and it includes both carbon uptake and storage. Carbon is stored in living and dead trees, down trees, understory, roots, and soil. That's what we can deal with in terms of confronting sequestration. The older and larger trees have far more leaf area and mass, and they sequester and store far more carbon. When a tree is cut, its capacity to sequester carbon is lost, and most of the carbon is lost, and it may take centuries to come back from this. In the meantime, we have extraordinary forest resources here in the Northeast. If you look at New Jersey, you'll see the top half of New Jersey is part of the highlands that Emile was talking about, which has the kind of carbon density of much of New England, except, of course, Maine, which is heavily logged. But it still has a fair amount of carbon, just like the New Jersey pinelands. And we have to take advantage of that. Over time, we have tried to confront forest management in in very important ways. One of the first things, of course, we did was green acres and the conservation of natural resources, which brought a basic halt to logging. And woodland management plans persisted for private property. During that time, however, basically many of the largest trees were taken from private land, and now they're sitting there on public land. The Forest Stewardship Act was passed in 2010, recognizing that private land needed to recover, that it had a need for restoration and management, and it allowed for the cessation of logging. But in the 20 years ago, Christie opened public lands to logging. There have been several logging bills. And right now, the New Jersey Forest Task Force is looking at the issue of what is the proper management of New Jersey's forests. I'm going to tell you what I think the proper management of New Jersey's forests is, basically. We have to be looking at climate resilience, and that's really going to depend on large trees and intact forest. These are absolutely crucial for dealing with the issues of carbon. The largest tree in the forest may take up and store more carbon than hundreds of the smaller trees. In fact, maybe than all the smaller trees in that acre. Proforestation is the name for the silvicultural practice of protecting trees, not logging them, not removing them from the forest. It gives you an immediate benefit of increasing carbon storage and the reversal of emissions from logging. Unfortunately, in the next decade, where we have to confront all of this, we are not well equipped. The Forest Service's 5 priorities don't include carbon storage or climate change or biodiversity. The New Jersey Forest Action Plan, the New Jersey 80/50 report does not promote protection of existing forests, only from development. If we are going to meet the New Jersey's goal for sequestration, we need to protect our forests. Reforestation, afforestation are nice, but they'll take decades to increase sequestration. Another impact of logging that we have to confront is the damage to soil, which is really fairly severe. One of the things we see is that 40% of the carbon stored in an older forest might be in the soil itself and the fungal root networks. That carbon is lost during harvest and takes decades to recover. The soil losses are twice as great in forests that are thinned. And of course, we see the decline of conservative plants and wildlife. Conservative plants and wildlife are those that are really vulnerable to the impacts of human activities and human development. And for example, in the case of salamanders, they're also very important in terms of carbon storage, which is hard to imagine, but very true. And that many of our most vulnerable species are just disappearing from the landscape and rapidly being replaced. Then salvage logging comes along and compounds all the problems of logging in the first place. You would think, like some other areas, that New Jersey would be aware of the fact of the impacts of logging, especially on public lands, which have been protected so far. But right now, management by logging is very prevalent on public land, despite a lot of people being extremely concerned about it. But it's not called logging. It's called management for health, thinning for diversity, things like that. On Sparta Mountain, in just one almost clear cut, 16 football fields were cleared of large 150 to 175-year-old oaks, which is absolutely the worst thing you can do in terms of protecting our carbon storage and our ability to sequester carbon. But it was all done in the name of a young forest. I want to compare two things. I want to look at forestry and ecological restoration. The best of forestry is definitely represented by the works of Jerry Franklin and his partners, Johnson & Johnson. Their most recent book is on ecological forestry, and it's focused on practices that maintain the integrity of the forest, etc. The sustainability of the harvest is the focus, however. It's fundamentally about harvesting trees. Ecological restoration, on the other hand, is focused on restoring a damaged landscape to its natural successional trajectory. Proforestation, which I mentioned earlier, protecting growing forests to their full ecological potential for carbon storage and structural complexity in the absence of harvesting wood products, is the kind of silvicultural management you would use with ecological restoration. While the information on the forest calculations of forest density and forest age that are typical in ecological forestry, when you're looking at ecological restoration, the focus is on what's on the ground, who's reproducing, what's the trajectory, and the monitoring is much more going to be focused on floristic quality assessment, at least in terms of vegetation, which looks at how conservative, how vulnerable the species are. One of the biggest problems, however, is that many of the current logging practices are driven by claims of ecological management. Jerry Franklin, whom I mentioned earlier, observed after Mount St. Helens that the areas that were recovering naturally were a wildlife paradise, and urged the Forest Service to both stop salvation logging and replanting. He later spoke about the opportunity to maybe cut small holes in young plantations, young super dense plantations, to create young successional forest habitat. He was immediately challenged by his two co-authors, who were upset about the fact and said the Forest Service will use this to cut into mature forests. And of course, they were right. That is exactly what has happened with the Young Forest Initiative. It ignores other forest values, such as carbon storage. It's shown a lot of poor site selection in New Jersey. And in fact, it's interior species that are more critically endangered. 28 of the 90 are in decline. It ignores extensive opportunities to restore degraded young forest. But unfortunately, it gets supported by government incentives. When we look at Sparta Mountain, for example, this is what's being cut down in the name of creating a young forest habitat. This is the ring count on ages of some of the trees that were removed for the purposes of making young forest. It seems a really problematic trade-off from my perspective, and it's basically catastrophic in terms of climate and carbon storage. And of course, where's it going? It's not even staying in the state. These huge logs are going elsewhere to be processed. And what is left behind? Ruts that a person could drown in. Damage to wetland vernal pools that were not properly marked and protected. Paths that have been widened dramatically and now are corridors for the invasion by invasive species. And what do we get within a very short period of time? Those trees sprout rapidly and you have a dense sprout jungle and nothing like what it was intended to be. And in the meantime, for example, in the highlands, the most threatened birds are the birds of the forest, not the birds of edges and openings. And when we look at Sparta Mountain, for example, you can see in the logging plan that now it's nothing but park marked with holes where both carbon storage has been lost and the objective of sustaining young successional species has not been achieved. And this doesn't only happen where young successional habitat is being created. It happens in areas where they're talking about stand improvements, such as Weldon Brook. And when you compare the trees that were logged versus the trees that were left behind, you can see that the log trees were significantly larger in diameter, even though the defense was logging the younger, more uniform ages. Another typical logging solution would be a fire break, which are very, very important. Here's an example of one that is often shown with 90% canopy removal down in the pinelands. Unfortunately, without any maintenance, it's grown up way more dense than it was before, and it actually represents a probably greater fire hazard than it did before. You will also see in many of the logging plans things that are preposterous, such as the area in this one that is designated for old growth management is a post-agricultural forest, which is a forest that has grown back since abandoned agriculture, and they're of the poorest quality and least likely to develop into old growth within a few centuries. What if we stopped logging and stopped removing wood from the forest, turned to proforestation, and looked at ecological restoration as a more appropriate management strategy for our natural forest areas? We would save 85% of the carbon that's lost yearly. We would regain half the sequestration potential. The natural forest is more insect resistant, less fire prone, and we can still manage it with prescribed burning and ecological restoration. We have to shift from the idea of thinking we can protect the canopy by thinning and logging management. We have to retain all the wood in the forest. We have to restrict the sale of timber and wood products from public forest. And we really have to put our energies into restoration, such as controlling deer and invasive plants. From the perspective of the restorationist, looking at the ground, the empty forest is possibly the most serious problem facing New Jersey other than climate change. While we have consistently advocated for better management strategies from the state, we've also had to resort extensively to exclosures in order to allow the recovery of plants, which can typically be very, very rapid. And in some areas, like here, a whole field full of trout lily has come back within 2 years of putting up the exclosure. Another major problem in New Jersey, of course, is the infested forest. If we stopped logging, it would reduce the spread of invasives immediately, just as it would reduce the numbers of deer immediately. And the restorationists will regularly focus on both removing invasive species and planting and protecting native species. One good example of a person focused on restoration is a site in New Jersey where there was a logging plan, but the owner fenced the site instead and failed to do the logging. He had what he called a forest garden. He saw a lot of ground layer recovery when he started his fencing program, from herbaceous plants to trees. You can see there was originally a lot of stiltgrass that was completely overwhelmed quite rapidly. This is that forest 20 years later. When his forester came out to assess it, Duke Grimes was at first horrified he didn't do what he'd been told to do, but was thrilled with the results. And Wayne Johnson, who was the state forester reviewing it, said anybody who does this kind of forest improvement should call him if he wants some approvals. When we look at restoration plans, they look quite different from logging plans. They, of course, are going to focus on things like managing deer, but we're also going to look at baseline monitoring of all the species. In the case of South Branch restoration, it required reestablishing the original grades and daylighting some of the streams, as well as planting native species and developing a long-term management plan. On this site, Michael Van Cleef, for example, did a rather extraordinary survey of invasive species, as well as a management program. And the entire site was monitored using floristic quality assessment, which can be found at universalfqa.org. Floristic quality assessment focuses on the naturalness of a site based on the conservatism that is the vulnerability, that the allegiance of that plant to an intact ecosystem. And it really is based only on that aspect of botany. And one of the things we see, especially when we look at things like the floristic quality, is that past land use really matters. These sites, for example, shown in green, are the areas that were never agricultural soil in the highlands. And Michael Van Cleft and Emile DeVito have been documenting how much higher quality they are than the areas that are regrown forest from abandoned agricultural areas. Protecting these lands is the most secure way to protect the rarest and most vulnerable species, because it's native soil instead of a post-agricultural soil. When we look at the floristic quality of post-agricultural soils and historic forest soils, there's a really significant difference. And it also drives what we can and need to do as someone involved in restoration. My first confrontation with an agricultural soil was aside from my own farm, was in Central Park in New York. And when we arrived in Central Park, it was apparent that the soil was either all completely compacted or in fact churned with all organic matter consumed by earthworms. It was pretty depressing. But the goal was restoration, and the Conservancy was very committed, and we quickly organized a restoration team who started their work with protecting the site. Of course, it was being trampled madly by the millions of visitors to Central Park. The police were driving through the park willy-nilly. There was a big blowdown of locusts. We used it to make fencing, and you can see there was immediate recovery. People were kind of cooperative with that. A lot of the bare ground we sowed with meadows because people don't like bugs, and it kept the tramplers out of the areas that were under the little woodlands. We also began really significant management of invasive species. And you can see from the before and after that once the invasives are removed, a lot of the ground is gone. We realized that going for an agricultural evaluation of our soil was not going to get us where we wanted to go. We realized that the amount of sand and silt was not what we were interested in. We were interested in the life of the soil. And we began looking at the soil food web. A food web in general is comprised of all the species that have a relationship based on who eats what. In soil, exactly the same is true. Luckily, as we were getting involved with this, we encountered Elaine Ingham, who really helped us understand how to confront a soil that was really very, very damaged. Her specialty was the living components of the soil, and we sent her samples from the old woods in Central Park, and she wrote back and she said, "But these are agricultural soils. How can they be from your older forest?" And then we realized that we really had a major problem, and we started working with her to understand the issues of how soil biological succession is intimately connected to plant succession, and that our forest was out of whack. Our forest was largely bacteria-driven with very few fungi. And the problem with bacteria is that when nitrogen is used, they release it very, very rapidly. The soil's job is basically, or the soil food web's job, is basically to cycle nutrients such as nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus in a process called mineralization. But how they're handled makes a real difference. Nitrogen, for example, determines the rate at which carbon is broken down. In an early successional landscape that's bacteria-driven, carbon's broken down really, really rapidly. turns into nitrate. A lot of it is leached. But as the soil develops, as succession proceeds, the fungi begin to take over until we get to a mature soil, which is really going to be largely fungi driven. And the nitrate will be in the form of ammonium, because that's what the fungi produce. You'll notice that 80% of the ammonium goes to storage, again, increasing our carbon. This is probably the most significant slide that I can show you tonight, because it talks about the goal of not only proforestation, but restoration, is bringing the landscape into sync with its soil, where we have seen really, really dramatic and impossible changes taking place. For example, if a woodland soil is dominated by bacteria, it's leaching nutrients rapidly. The older plants might be starving, but it might be covered with exotic invasives, which love that condition a whole lot, the rapid release of nutrients. Working with Elaine, we began to realize that if we wanted to foster the soil of an older forest, that we really had to start looking at wood, the most indigestible product, the food of the older forest. This is what the older forest leaves a lot of. And even the leaves of the older forest tend to be much higher in lignin compared to cellulose, like the younger forests. Things become very slowly digested. Bacteria does not like wood. And so we really focused on ways to use wood in this landscape, from nurse logs, which is the areas where we focused on seedlings, using wood in every restoration capacity. Old trails we cover with a very thin layer of wood chips and then lots of pieces of wood. And they were covered in a remarkable way without a lot of exotic invasion. In areas where we had compaction that was just almost beyond belief, rather than trying to loosen it, have more erosion and instability. And every time you work that soil, you stimulate bacteria. We instead use wood, driving just dead wood from the site and from other sites in New York into the soil. And in fact, every little wooden planting zone became a place where we saw understory recovery. At that point, replanting native species really became an option because they were surviving. It was a very different landscape. It took a number of years to get to this point. For the first years, the ground layer was completely consumed by the earthworms. Even years of starting to do, making wood block areas of drainage and to capture the leaves. It wasn't until the winter of 93, 94, I think it was, when Central Park was covered with ice. And the next season we had a ground layer. And from that moment, recovery began dramatically. At the same time, restorationists are dealing with exactly the opposite. Rare species and specialized landscapes that need an entirely different kind of management. In some places, we might need to remove trees and chop and drop and leaving the carbon on site. I spent a long time at Bennett Bog with Edgar Wary every year, removing trees from that specialized little bog. You can also make small openings akin to the habitats that were created on Sparta Mountain by logging large trees. We can create them by, in fact, girdling a very few trees, making smaller openings because we don't have to ramp it up to a scale that is economic for forestry and heavy-duty logging. We can avoid all those kinds of damages to the soil. And in fact, all that equipment can be carried in without any roads, any of that kind of disturbance. The reality is that New Jersey is being rapidly and seriously damaged by all kinds of insects and other problems. Storms, the emerald ash borer might be taking up to 13% of New Jersey's trees. We have gaps galore that could provide the kind of young habitat that is really required for effective management of diversity, for bringing in the species of the small little glades. What we have to look at is how to manage gaps, not with logging and not by creating forest, but by managing the gaps themselves, controlling deer, managing invasives and planting natives, keeping the wood on site for soil food webs, managing erosion, looking at prescribed as well as free burning, and very importantly, education and citizen science and monitoring, if we're really going to go forward. I want to look right now at one of my favorite and one of the oldest restoration projects going on. Actually, the work in the Wissahickon began in the 70s with a dentist who started with trail repair, but it gradually developed into the Wissahickon Restoration Volunteers, which as a group has been working for decades. One of the first things they did was to really determine the areas that were most impacting the forest. They identified these sites, all of which are at forest edges, where there are parking lots, where there are entrances, and where most of the problems are seriously beginning. A kind of basic then was to defend these edges and to get rid of them as the sources of problem and making them a whole complement of wooding plants. This is one along in 2011. This is one in 2004. You'll notice the tubular deer guards. After that year, they were pretty quickly abandoned, and the group started making much larger guards that could be reused and with wood and steel, and that they could actually get shrubs in, etc. They included a lot of fast-growing shade-intolerant species on the edge, like the betula, but they also did more extensive planting beyond those edges. You can see the way they've used the wood to catch drainage and to use all of these logs as nurse logs as these edges are planted. And of course, by 2016, we're looking at a remarkably different landscape and a really critically a different level of protection for that forest. They are also now being able to reduce shade-tolerant species for the long term, many of which have been excluded by deer, but there's intensive planting. And they are also reintroducing a shrub layer and small trees throughout this landscape. This is what our public forests need. This is the involvement of the local community at the highest level, an ongoing commitment. We are not going after carbon as if it was completely expendable. And these kind of plantings create the kind of young landscapes that the foresters keep talking about. And in the Wissahickon, we're actually seeing the floor recovering because this is original native soil and was not all reworked like Central Park. Another thing, of course, that the restoration is used as a major tool is fire as a natural process. That includes prescribed burning, but the other goal of creating a large enough fire breaks that you can allow large natural burns to take place, which are much closer to the way the natural systems work. And one of the important things about looking at a more natural forest system is that charred forests store more carbon than thin forests. The prescribed burning releases less carbon over time than wildlife. That the intact forest is less susceptible to fire, and that fire reduces bacteria in the soil and fosters fungi. It supports understory regeneration, probably because of bacterial reductions. The biggest problems are usually the residents, and this is a matter of important education. When we look at the pinelands, which is a fire-induced managed landscape, even in an extremely hot burn, there's a less than 10% tree death. Most of the trunks are alive. There's maximization of the retention of carbon, but it also closely mimics a natural process. But it also prepares that landscape for the future. Fire is an increasing threat, and a hot burn resets that clock much more effectively. When we're looking at fire management for fire protection, such as a fire break, rather than clearing away 90% of the trees, a more effective solution is to clear from the ground up. This is a 150-foot wide fire break. Nothing was removed from this site, so there's almost no impact on carbon storage, but it was mown to maintain no ladder fuels from the ground to the canopy. And as you can see from looking above, it doesn't look wildly different from the forest next to it from above, but you can see that it's a little more open. And when we're on the ground, you can see exactly how that fire break works. This can be done without logging at all. We're also looking at fire management in areas that have been more protected from fire, but were probably burned more historically by indigenous populations. We need a lot more experimentation, but some of it's happening in Morris County Park, and we're looking at it very closely, where you're seeing a lot of recovery of native understory, as well as suppression of many exotics. It's not a one-shot deal, one-shot management at all, but it's something that is really being studied and evaluated right now on a smaller scale. It does require proper deer management because these will be eaten as a fantastic meal for deer, if not adequately protected. We are also, however, in burned areas, seeing oaks reappear. And that's really crucial because they aren't showing up in the areas where they've been cleared in order to create gaps for more oaks. We're seeing more maple and birch in these. But in the fire zones, oaks are coming back, and it's a really important management to consider for gaps. And of course, a lot of spring ephemerals really think that fire is fantastic. They have a little bit of feeding at a time when they're present and there's not a lot of competition without getting the giant flush of nutrients that fosters all those invasives. At every level, the soil is really where it's at. And it's not just issues related to logging. It's really issues related to anything, such as this pipeline that went through Lewannica Park many years ago. You'll notice that at that time, a conventional cross-section was 50 feet, but every little bit of the soil was seriously disturbed, from everything under the equipment to the ditch that's dug to the spoil pile on the other side and the vegetation that's simply destroyed. Working with a contractor, we were able to develop a cross-section that completely respected soil by moving the pipeline to an existing trail and effectively widening that trail by taking the wood chips that we had to create from thinning a little bit in order to swing that side boom, and then put the topsoil on top of that so that we had a real cushion and that the soils adjacent were protected. The soil over the pipeline trench itself was lifted and stored on the side, again under a layer of wood chips, so that we could reclaim it later on. Here it is in its active cross-section. You can see harvesting the sod mats. They're on the left, on the bottom side. The pipeline is in the middle. And then you can see the elevated side boom operating on top of the spoil pile. Everything moved through basically in one day's time. So all of it was very temporary, and the soil was removed. Today, you'd have more protection for workers than was shown in that one. But immediately afterwards, the site was fenced, and a season later, it's coming back with much of the same plant material that was there before and the trees replanted. This site was studied decades later, and the ground layer here was just like the ground layer in the woods next to it. It was not your classic miserable pipeline disturbance zone. Same techniques, save the soil, save all of it. The mats were harvested and staked along the stream edge and came back very quickly. We're faced with a choice right now. Do we want to treat our natural areas, our public forests, like this natural wildlife protection site in Louisiana, where I am right now, Do we want to keep treating this the way we're treating our forests in New Jersey? Or do we want to go to restoration and proforestation? Together, these two approaches, I think, are what we need in our public forests. Grow them to their full carbon uptake potential. They'll be 3 times as effective as a thin forest. And the management focus should be ecological restoration, which initiates or accelerates ecosystem recovery following degradation, damage, or destruction. The goal is to put it back on a historic trajectory, not back to a historic condition. You can't do that. Fortunately, there are very real guidelines about this that have been developed over the decades by the Society for Ecological Restoration. My goal is 1 million acres of carbon reserves managed by ecological restoration in the state of New Jersey. Half our forest in New Jersey is public forest, half is private. We could make 1 million acres of public forest as our carbon reserves. And I think it's the way to go in New Jersey. I just want to give you some information to things that I've referred to in this talk. Obviously, it's supported by the Highlands Coalition, but you can get good information as well from the Northeast Forest Watch and Standing Trees. You will see that there is a large regional area of concern about forests. If you are interested in ecological restoration, there is a primer prepared by them as well as guidelines for the decade of restoration, which is especially comprehensive. And they have certified ecological planners, which you could use for planning purposes in the state of New Jersey. It's not that they know everything, but they have the right focus. There's the floristic quality assessment I referred to, and my own book, The Once and Future Forest. Most of what I've talked about is in that book, even though it's 30 years old. Thank you very much. I can take some questions.
Hi, Leslie.
Hi there.
This is Emile, and we've got some questions that have come in. So I think the first one I want to focus on is a question about maturity in forests. Question is there not such a thing as over-mature forests? And would you comment on whether or not smaller trees in younger forests have more oxygen and uptake? More CO2 uptake and oxygen production than older forests with large trees?
Yeah, there's been a lot of back and forth over the years on that latter question about young forests and old forests. And much of it stems from a misinterpretation of a scientific article that was spread all around incorrectly. It is true at some level that there's a faster rate of restoration for small forests, but that sequestration includes both the rate of respiration and the storage. And when you look at that, it's leaf area that determines the amount of storage. Large trees store more and sequester more than small trees, period. Maybe hundreds of times more. A 60-inch tree is worth probably 600 small trees. And your first question was over-mature. Over-mature is a forestry term. It relates to the value of that in terms of logging. Over-mature has nothing to do with anything resembling an ecological forest perspective. Something that's over-mature is going to fall over and become carbon through its root system, through its decomposition, etc. It's just part of that cycle.
So you touched on this in your talk, but there was a couple of questions about, you were talking about looking at the ground. So there was a question about what are your thoughts on removing debris from the ground in the forest?
I don't remove anything from the forest. It's all forest food. The difference is that there's different kinds of forest food. And in New York, where we have very disturbed forests, for example, we really wanted to advance the kind of lignin-rich, the wood-rich food for our forests. But the bottom line is you don't take anything out. In New York, we had to bring stuff in because we did not have enough wood. But where you have a native soil, you will have enough wood if you don't take it out for forestry purposes, if you don't damage the soil with logging equipment where you reset the clock and it's a bacterial soil instead of an advanced forest soil, you want that forest soil to match the growth level of your trees. And at that point, humus becomes a really important part of water storage because you don't need much of that for nutrition purposes. And it's just a vital thing to do. And it's the mistake we make. We keep resetting the clock on the soil without realizing that we're really compromising the growth rate. Every possible benefit of the forest is compromised if you take its food away, especially the food it needs most, which is the wood, not the other materials.
Another question along similar lines about what's happening on the ground. We showed slides of the empty forest at one point that was caused by deer. And have you seen any calculations on how much forest, what's the impact of forest carbon storage and uptake because of deer in these overbrowsed forests? Or do you think that that impact is more of a future impact as opposed to a, impact right now on site?
Well, it's an impact right now because there's layers of the forest that aren't there. They may not be the big sequesterers, but they're no baby trees. They're going to be the big sequesterers. So it is a big deal. But the real bottom line is you just need to allow the forest to develop naturally. And the deer are just a monstrous obstacle to this. And the state has failed to address it. The state in many areas seeks to increase the population.
You may have covered this in your talk, but there's a question about going from an agricultural soil to a fungi-driven soil. Is there any way to speed that up? Is there any way to promote that?
Well, we felt we did in New York, and we saw dramatic levels of recovery. And that was basically feeding the soil what it needed. So, of course, first thing we tried to do was to develop a litter layer, which in many instances you don't have yet. But this was a wooded landscape that was like an agricultural soil because it had been very disturbed. If I was going from an ag soil to a forest, what I would do in most cases would fence it to protect it from deer and then remove invasive species. Most of our forests are close enough that there are lots of sources of tree material. The problem is it gets eaten. And the bigger issue is shrubs and herbaceous species. But they can develop when protected from deer. If this ag soil, you may have to, though, over time, if you want more valuable species, have to plant them. We had to plant them in New York. It was all regraded. It was not ever a natural terrain. There were no things there. We had some fungi that we found when we did big soil surveys. They were very deep, but they could be worked with. But we didn't have very many native species that came in at the ground layer. A few herbaceous species did, and certainly not many shrubs. We added them. And then if they took, they took. If they didn't, we didn't bother with any of that area again. But the bottom line is once we confronted the soil in our post-ag woodlands, we were able to control the invasives problem. We were not turning into a nitrogen leaching landscape by continuously working the soil, logging it, etc. We were just packing it with wood, thin layers of wood chips, maybe one chip deep, 40, 60% coverage. We also did things like brought in soil plugs from the Adirondacks. Elaine assured us if the soil was ready, it would take it. And there'd be a lot of redundancy very quickly. We did things like took little mats of wood chips up to the Adirondacks till they were colonized by fungi, and they would bring them in and tack them in the woods. I mean, it became a really fungi-focused thing for quite a while, but it was all about wood.
There was a picture where you showed that inside a deer fence, a bunch of trout lilies came back, and there was a question about whether or not they were invasive species or not. And of course, trout lilies are a native, and since that was a native soil that you were working in, the trout lilies were just there waiting for something good to happen.
Wait.
So I just wanted to mention that. But
Yeah.
when you have when you use fire and you do prescribed burning, the question is, and when you use prescribed burning and or thinning to some extent, does this sometimes increase the fire risk, or does it release a lot of carbon? So are you
Yeah, there are two reasons why that is not an issue. One is that even a burnt forest stores more carbon than a thinned forest. A thin forest is the fastest way to lose carbon. The other thing we found out over time is it does not protect you from fire. This was adequately demonstrated all through California, Australia, Russia, Romania. It increases the velocity of wind through the forest, which is how you carry embers in a fire, and it happens during periods of drought. It is not reduced by thinning. Prescribed burning, I think, is the best way to avoid fire problems, but I think it should be complemented in, I think you do need some fire breaks, and I think that thinning from below, which does not reduce canopy, is an effective way to create a fire break. And I think hot fires are necessary. We have to prepare for the future forest. And that we have to do by letting the forest sort itself out. The same thing with insects. I think we've learned with the ash borer, don't take these trees. Some of them may be resistant. We need them. This was demonstrated with bark beetles in the West. 15% on one unsalvaged log site survived the first time. 45% survived the next time. They were genetically slightly different. We have to let the forest manage itself. We have to let it be eaten by bugs because natural forest fire fares better than plantations. We have to let it burn to get ready for what the future is. This is what resilience is all about, without losing a lot of carbon, because we've not been fools by cutting our big forests or by failing to protect our forests from thinning.
There's a few questions about whether or not you should ever remove wood from a forest. What are some certain, may some circumstances crop up where you would actually want to remove some material from the forest?
Whoever says never relative to a natural situation is probably asking for trouble. But since we got into this discussion, I have been looking for reasons to remove wood from the forest. I have called people about it. And I have two sites I'd like to go back to, Emile. The one in Weldon Brook where the wood was all left behind. And then there's another site where it was all taken out. And I think we should look at them more recently. But I think there isn't much of a good reason for taking it out. In the one site they were concerned about invasives, maybe some management would have been affected. I think in most cases, I can't think of a case where taking the wood out is advisable. I don't know yet. If it's infected with something, destroy it on site. Don't move it all around and try to, leave a trail of problems.
There's a couple of questions about private lands. Do you think New Jersey should incentivize private landowners to sequester carbon as opposed to, producing wood products? I mean, we know that with the Forest Stewardship Act of 2009, landowners are not required to remove products anymore. They're not required to. And so the question is, should they be incentivized?
Well, I think your first goal is to protect the forests we can actually protect before we incentivize protection. But we have made it possible, and I'd be thrilled if the state would incentivize protection. I'd take 1.5 million acres if I could get it. But I think we can do 1 million acres almost by fiat. And, we have to do inventories. You could do that after you've declared it protected. You could do all kinds of things once it's protected. Once it's got an ecological focus, I can't think of many reasons why you're going to want to come up with a different answer.
There are a couple of questions about carbon release that are hinting at, how fast do trees decompose. So in other words, when you might do a small project to girdle some trees or drop some trees, or you have to cut down some invasive trees, how fast is that carbon released if the tree is left on the ground?
It's going to depend on a number of circumstances, particularly moisture levels. The bottom line in general, though, is that the bulk of it, typically over 90%, will be reincorporated into the soil in some capacity. It might also end up inside of a salamander, where it's effectively sequestered. They consume a lot of litter on the floor and protect it from being turned into nitrates and ammonium. And they actually are important sequesterers, but that is the goal. You're not going to gain anything the other way.
Okay, and finally, I think the last couple of questions that we might have time for have to do with sort of the political angle. You feel like, your concepts here that you presented tonight, where do you feel the biggest problem is in getting our public lands managed in that regard? You feel it's in legislators? Do you feel it's in rules and regulations that already exist? What are the obstacles in your view?
Well, part of the obstacle is just past history. The word proforestation was only coined, I think, in 2018, 2019. We've spent 40 years ignoring climate issues. As I said, it's not part of any of the New Jersey planning to protect forests. So it is really relatively new. And there is a whole body of propaganda on the other side about forestry, some of which is very skewed. As I noticed, some of these early successional habitat sites should not have been made out of ancient forests. But it's very difficult to counter some of this information because people tend to treat foresters as experts. They might be experts in forest sustainability, but they are not experts in ecological management. Our public forests were not meant to be about the sustainability of wood products, which store maybe 10% as opposed to 90% of a fallen tree. They were supposed to be about recreation and conservation. And that's what ecological restoration is about. Forestry is not about that. It may have been expanded recently by people like Jerry to be much more thoughtful about other species, about maintaining the whole ecosystem that supports the forestry system, since a lot of the forestry claims in the past didn't pan out. But it still doesn't make it the right approach for public forests. It makes it a better approach for private forests, but not the right approach for public forests.
Yeah, Jerry Franklin was here just a few years ago to give a talk at Duke Farms. And in response to one of the questions after his talk about, how much should be set aside for sort of a wilderness type situation versus land that should be set aside for, management through forestry practices, he said, well, I'm not going to put a number on that, but the first thing you have to do is figure out, before you figure out what you're going to manage, you have to figure out everything that you need to set aside. That was a very clear answer that he gave. And I think, that's one of the things that we've all been talking about lately is right now, almost nothing is set aside.
And you can do that immediately by fiat.
Yeah.
You make that a declaration. It doesn't prevent you from doing an inventory. It doesn't prevent you from observing, this place needs, like Bennett Bog, needs to have some trees removed or will lose a very special habitat. I'd be cutting cedar to save bog asphodel if it was up for me, but there wouldn't be a lot of it. And it would be done with a full inventory. It wouldn't be done. And I would leave the material on site. I haven't encountered a situation yet where taking it off was a better idea than leaving it behind. If there might be one, I'm not, never say never. But forestry is not the right approach. Protection can be done now, immediately, and it doesn't stop us from doing any level of inventory. We need rules, but we need rules that have a purpose. Once we declare that these things are so important for sequestration, once we declare they're a carbon reserve, and that we should not be logging them and we should leave the wood behind, then I think it's the time to make rules. You make rules now, you'll just get what we have now, which is the status quo, which is what I fear most.
Before we end, there is one question here about a topic that's become controversial in the news media in the last couple of months. There's the fire break in Bass River State Forest in the Pine Barrens, and a plan to make fire breaks along a couple of intersecting sand roads. And I just want to see what your comment might be about that. A lot of people focus on the fact that 2.4 million trees are going to be mowed. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, when I have read the proposal and I've talked to different people about it, and I do have a problem with some people's perspectives on this project vary slightly. So I'm not sure I have everything completely accurate. But my thoughts in general are that is the kind of fire break that is needed, I think, because it's a larger scale fire break that is meant to allow free burns. This fire break was done without major considerations of carbon management. I think if that had been part of the planning process at the outset, that this fire break might be different. For example, in addition to the mowing beneath the trees, which I fully support, as I showed in those slides, there appears to be in the plan sort of feathering the edge for aesthetic purposes with more logging. That's probably unnecessary logging. I don't think it has anything to do with making it effective fire break. There appear to be also some discrepancies concerning the snake issues, which I'm not qualified to comment on because I don't know the information about them. But I think every project that is underway, whether it's the cedar project, they would be different if we started today with a carbon perspective. We'd modify those projects today. But I think the creation of fire breaks, the reestablishment of cedar are really important concepts. And if I had the ability to go back and fix them, I would.
If you have additional questions, I'm sure that Dylan will be able to field some of those questions and pass them on to folks that are qualified to answer them. So
I think all of this is kind of new to people. It's new to me, and I've been wallowing in it for decades. But I think it's an important direction that we finally recognize. And New Jersey should be taking a leadership role again, like it used to. Why is New York ahead of us? Why are other places getting ahead of us? I think we should be in a leadership role. After all, how many other states have half their forests protected like we do? We're in a unique position. Vermont has, like maybe 10% of its forest protected. No wonder they need to please the loggers more. We don't. We have 50% protected forest.
Leslie, this has been really fantastic, especially the questions and answers and embellishing on your program. I want to thank you so much.
Thank you. It was an opportunity for me.
Leslie, it's always exciting and inspiring to see how much knowledge you bring to ecological restoration. It's absolutely staggering every time you do a webinar with us. We're going to call it there. I'd like to thank everyone for coming out and joining us tonight.
Thank you.